Thank you all for joining me, and welcome to another edition of Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, I'll be talking about people that can see the dead, strange supernatural mist, and existing in the living and spirit realms. But before we start, I'd like to thank Anonymous on Buy Me a Coffee and AR for their support and generosity. And please remember that anyone can show their support simply by sharing and reviewing the podcast. Or if you'd prefer to make a monetary contribution, you may do so through our patreon.com, buymeacoffee.com, and PayPal donation links. And if you've got a paranormal experience to share with me, you may contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or of course on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And all of our support and contact information can be found in the show notes. And now let's start the show with our first listener story of the night, which comes to us from Randy. And Randy's story is called Paranormal. Some parts of Randy's experience have to do with molestation, so please be warned. Randy says, "Greetings, Nick. As so many of your fans, I recently found your podcast and was immediately hooked. Your calm demeanor as you read our stories and do not judge or make comments afterwards is reassuring and confirming that this is a safe area for us. As for me, I have many a story of paranormal events in my life and find I will probably become a repeat customer, if you will, of stories to share. However, before I am able to get into any real stories, you and the audience have to get to know me a bit in order to understand the life that I live and what I experience every day of my existence. I will warn you that this may cause some trigger in people, but please understand that this is simply my experiences and what I feel led to this. I have often heard that people with experiences in the paranormal or supernatural often have a defining moment in their life that makes them more attuned to the world in between. Mine would be when I was 7 years old, as I am unable to remember any of the experiences happening before that age. At this age, I was molested by my best friend's father for close to a year, and shortly after this is when I began to notice things differently in my world. Orbs, objects moving on their own, items disappearing for days on end, different colored mist or smoke-like manifestations, to full-blown apparitions. Now, I know that often major events like a molestation or other traumatic events are often assigned to mental disorders. However, I want to assure the listeners and any skeptics that I have been probed, prodded, and gone through many medical tests physically and mentally to show that I am actually 100% normal by society standards. So these events that have happened in my life in the paranormal are exactly that, unexplained and sometimes horrific. Given the tests and multiple doctors telling me that I am completely healthy, I have had to define myself in a category, and anyone else that is similar to me, I give them permission to use my terminology if they feel that it helps to define them as well. I like to call myself binormal. Everything in my world is defined in this term by the choices I make, to my sexual orientation, political bias. Everything I do, I ride the fine line of the fence. I am unable to choose one side of any argument or debate, as I am able to see the entire coin, and able to see the compromise, the pros and the cons of everything. I even consider myself a bi-walker, where I am able to exist not only in this world, but also in the spirit world. Whether in the waking or the spirit world, I am able to easily flow between these worlds at any point I choose, and just exist there. I am able to experience things in both these worlds as they exist on the same plane of consciousness, and I am able to manipulate or manifest myself solely in these worlds or even in both simultaneously. Most of the time I choose to live in both worlds simultaneously as it offers the most unique way of seeing these worlds. The problem I have is, as I'm living in both worlds, I see both worlds together, including the beings on both sides. Oftentimes I will see people as I am walking through any store, like everyone else does, but I often see double the amount of people, if that makes sense. Not duplicate of the same person, but more like I am able to see if a spirit or entity is attached to them, or even just a random manifestation of a trapped soul in this location. They are as real to me as any other person, and if I were to bump into them, they would be as solid as people experience in this world. This will cause me to suddenly step sideways in an aisle, or walk as if I am drunk and staggering awkwardly through a store. Oftentimes I will be caught speaking to myself and apologizing to anyone I almost walk into. It can be a bit disconcerting at times. I am often followed through stores by security, and in a few rare occasions I am asked to never return. Oddly enough, by beings in both realms have I been asked not to return, to which I duly abide by their request. There is more to this existence I live, but this will suffice for now as an explanation, and hopefully everyone understands. As I stated earlier, I have plenty of paranormal stories to share, and will send in some of those stories to you soon. But for now, as this is getting rather lengthy, I will end this, and offer my contact information for any one of your listeners that has any specific questions regarding this, for you to share to them. Be blessed and safe to you, Nick, and to all of your listeners. Sincerely, Randy. I reached back out to Randy after this email and asked if they wanted me to divulge their email on the show, but I never got a response. So as of right now, if you'd like to reach out to Randy with one of your questions, just contact me and I'll forward your email on to them. This next story also comes from Randy, and Randy says, "Hello again, Nick. I am sending this to you within minutes of experiencing a more unusual event for myself. As I stated in my previous letter to you, I experience the paranormal daily. Existing in both the living and spiritual worlds, I see things I feel most people would be frightened by. However, I am very accustomed to it over the many years that I have experienced them, so I do not often get taken off guard. Today was one of those times. I'm quite used to seeing mist or smoke floating in random areas of rooms, places that are not near windows, vents, or caused by anything like a candle or vaporizer. Also, the misty smoke I see is often in random colors. My first instance of this was when I was 7 years old and when my family lived in New York. I was home with my mother and younger sister. We had been playing around on the stairs and down the hallways, just doing normal kid stuff. The stairs were directly in front of the front door, and there was a short hallway next to the stairs that led to the back of the house and to the kitchen. There was a large coat closet that was under the stairs and was about the full length of the hall. As my sister and I were coming off the stairs, we headed down this hallway when we were stopped dead. We both watched as this green vapor or smoke-like mass grew from out of the closet and just hazed in front of us. It appeared to stop just as we did, like it was startled by us as we were of it. For what must have been 2 minutes, we all just stood there, and without warning the smoke then dissipated and was gone. My sister and I looked at each other and simply decided that we did not see anything. However, a couple of days later I was walking down this same hallway, and as I passed the closet again, I noticed the green mist again. This time it followed me down the hall, into the kitchen, and stayed with me for a good hour that day. This went on for about another year while we lived in the house. I never felt afraid of it, and it was more just a sense of friends, and a bond with whatever it was. Fast forward to today, I am now 41 and I live in Michigan. I have experienced many other smoky entities in my day, but none ever so friendly as the green smoke in New York. There have only been a few that felt more evil in nature or mischievous. I also want to dispel the notion of black or red smoke as bad or evil, as today the smoke I saw was in a light blue spectrum, and this smoke was definitely not friendly either. It was just after 3 p.m. when I was walking in from the store. I had just finished putting the last of my groceries into the fridge, and I turned around to look into the bags to make sure that I did not forget anything. I turned back to close the fridge, and it was there. I was taken back for a minute as it just appeared only 2 inches from me. This entity took little time to slam the fridge door for me and begin to form itself into a more solid being. I quickly retorted to its actions by thanking it for closing the door, but this seemed to irritate it more than to accept my gratitude. This was evident when it then pushed a box of Hamburger Helper off the counter. I was not amused, and I turned to this being and cursed it for screwing around. I asked it what it wanted and to please not throw stuff around my house. I just stood there and I could feel it trying to form itself more. It was straining and using a lot of its energy when it reached out to take a hold of my arm. It began to drain my own energy, trying to complete its transformation, for lack of better terminology. I began to feel nauseous and weak in my knees. The entity was getting much stronger as I was weakening, so much so that my arm was aching under its touch. I grabbed back at its arm and tried to rip it off my arm, but to no avail. Whatever this entity wanted, it required my energy. All of it. This was not my first encounter like this, and I have plenty of tricks in which to fight back, especially in these instances, and this one required a little intervention from my own guardian, actually both my guardians, and that's a different story for a different time. I have two attached guardians, one that's more angelic, and one a demon. These two work together as well as fight each other, but when I am in trouble, they are there for me. In this instance, the angelic side began to replenish my energy with his, while the demon side grabbed a hold of the smoke and began to fight it. This went on for no more than 2 minutes at most, but it drained me quite a bit, until the smoke finally gave in and released me. I immediately did not waste any time that I had, and I crawled with the little energy that I had to a cross that I keep with me from my grandfather that I received on my first communion. I took the cross off the wall and began to tell the mist that it was not allowed in this house, and that this house is protected by the Lord. My demon guardian let go of the mist and began to dissipate. A bright light then began to enter the room and envelop the mist, and removed it from the house. I apologize for the length of this letter, but I had to explain the two sides of mists that I encounter, and I am still rather drained from earlier, but it was important to me to express what happened as soon as I could, so I could get the full story out. Again, thank you for sharing this if it makes it to the podcast. Truly yours, Randy. Our next story of the night comes to us from Michelle, and Michelle's story is called I See Dead People. Part of Michelle's story involves a drug overdose and may be uncomfortable for some listeners. Michelle says, Hi Nick, I just want to say I love the podcast. I've been listening for quite some time and I'm still not caught up. I've been listening carefully hoping to hear a story like mine, and so far I haven't, but I'm hoping that someone out there can relate and share, as I've never been able to really talk about it with anyone who actually would believe me. I'm a sensible, down-to-earth woman. I'm 52, but in my mind I'm still young. I've been having experiences since I was a child. I have to say, these experiences terrified me almost daily growing up. Although I have many stories, they don't compare to the fact that I see dead people on a regular basis. I will begin at the beginning so as not to confuse anyone. As a child, I remember my grandpa from out of state visiting me in the middle of the day while I was awake to tell me how he loved me, and for me to tell my dad that he was gone. Looking back on this as an adult, I realized that at the time this happened, I didn't know I was talking to a dead person. He didn't look like any of the descriptions I've heard other people talk about. He was real and just looked like he always did. Anyway, he knew my dad would be so sad that he wasn't able to go home to see him before he passed. I think he just wanted my dad to know that he was okay. I told my dad what he said, and my dad immediately went to the phone to call home. My grandma asked him how he knew since it had literally just happened. My grandpa had a massive stroke and was pronounced dead at the hospital before my grandma was even able to leave to go and see him. She didn't drive and had to wait for my uncle to pick her up, as there were no cell phones in those days. She had just hung up with the doctor when my dad called. I'm sure they discussed the whole incident, but not in front of me, so I don't know anything about what was said. This happened a few times while I was growing up, but by that time I had grown fearful of anything paranormal, and I did my best to block it all out. The other thing that happens almost every night since I can remember is that I hear voices when I go to bed and close my eyes. People talk to me all the time. A lot of people. They keep me awake late into the night sometimes. It's like being in a crowd of people and everyone talking at the same time. I used to try to block them out so I could focus on one voice, but it never worked. I wasn't sure if I was crazy or if it really happened. I'd heard stories of schizophrenic people who heard voices in their head. I think I couldn't filter out the voices because I was too afraid. As a teenager, I grew up fishing with my uncle. We were very close, but I was relieved that after he died, he didn't visit me. But 3 years later, he came. He just showed up after I laid down in my bed one night. I put my hands over my ears, but I could still hear him talking. He looked just like a regular person. No seeing through him, and nothing to indicate that he was even dead, except for the fact that I had gone to his funeral, and I knew that he really was dead. This went on for a few minutes until he finally said that he would leave me alone if I would give my aunt, his sister, a message. I reluctantly agreed. He told me that my cousin had moved into an unsafe home and that she needed to put a bar in her sliding glass doors. I passed on the info, and he never bothered me again. My aunt and cousins were firm believers in the paranormal and found none of this odd in any way. 2 weeks later, my cousin called my aunt to say that a man tried to break into her home while she was sleeping, but couldn't get the sliding glass door open because she had put a broomstick in the bottom track, so the door wouldn't open. They always wanted to talk about the creepy stuff that I saw, but I was not having any of it. It terrified me. Moving on to several years later, and my son was in the hospital about an hour away from our home. He was being released, so I drove over to pick him up. We decided to go have lunch at a Chinese restaurant before we made the drive back home. We walked in and were seated at a 2-person table against the wall. While we were waiting for our food, I watched 2 older women and 1 older man come in and sit down at the big table meant for large groups. The lunch rush was over, so the waitress told them that they could sit anywhere. I glanced over several times during our meal and saw that the old man kept watching me and smiling. It bothered me that someone was watching me eat, so I tried to ignore him. I figured he had nothing better to do since the 2 women were busy chatting, and he probably couldn't have got a word in if he tried. We finished our meal and were waiting for the check when I mentioned that I was ready to get out of there because the old man wouldn't stop watching me. My son asked, "What old man?" So I pointed him out. My son then got a look of horror on his face. He looked scared to death and said, "Mom, there is no old man over there. There are 2 old ladies talking, and that's it. If you're seeing an old man in the mix, then I'm going to just wait outside for you. I hate when this happens." He then got up and walked out. I then looked back at the table, and sure enough, the old man was still sitting there looking at me. I couldn't see through him. He wasn't floating or any of the other things that I hear about. I then walked to the cash register, paid our bill, and left. As I was going out the door, I looked back to see if he was still there, and I saw him wave as I rushed out. At this point, I finally realized that I was probably seeing dead people all the time, but I had no way of knowing because they don't look like dead people. I can't very well go around asking people if they see what I'm seeing, so they can confirm that I'm seeing a dead person. I don't call them ghosts because they don't look or act like ghosts. Fast forward to 2010. My youngest daughter passed away at 16 years old. I was devastated. My family was devastated. I really thought I would die from the pain that I was going through. At one point, I was so broken that I didn't want to feel anything. Let me say here that I was not suicidal in any way. I had previously been in a motorcycle accident and had broken my neck, and I still had the bottle of painkillers and other narcotics. I started taking them. I would take some pills, go to sleep, wake up, take more pills, go back to sleep, and so on. It was a vicious cycle that lasted for days. At some point, I finally took too many. My sister came over on a Monday morning to pick me up for work since we both worked for the same company. She found me barely breathing in my bed, and she called 911. After some point after I had made it to the hospital, I stopped breathing, and at this point I had a near-death experience, and I saw my daughter. I won't go into details since this is already so long, but she was crying and upset and told me to please stop doing this to myself. I was trying to get over to where she was standing, but she stepped back away from me and put her hands up. She said, "I love you, Mom," and then walked back through a door behind her. When I finally came to, I couldn't remember anything for days before and after the drug overdose. I did, however, remember every detail of my near-death experience. I was doubting that it had really happened until I went to a follow-up appointment with the doctor. He asked me what I saw, so I told him. I could remember everything down to the tiniest details. I told him what he was doing, what the nurses were doing, who was there, and so on. He confirmed that everything I said was what actually happened. I think that validation was the beginning of my recovery back to the real world. I turned all of my feelings off and went on. It's not a healthy way to live, but the only way I thought that I could get through it all. I have since been diagnosed with PTSD. Ever since the death of my daughter, I haven't seen dead people, I don't think, and I haven't heard voices. I suspect it's because of the trauma and that I have turned all my feelings off. Things had been quiet for several years, up until about a year ago. It all started happening again, and I didn't know how to stop it. Since my near-death experience, I've lost all fear of seeing dead people, hearing voices, and all of the other experiences that I have almost every day. I'm not afraid anymore, but I have no control over it. My boss's mother, who I have never met before, passed away, and she came to me wanting me to pass on a message or two. A few others have come as well. The people I want to see, like my daughter and my dad, don't come to me, and I don't understand why. Maybe there are rules that you have to follow when you die. I don't know. I know this has been a very long story. The whole reason I've written is to find out if any of your listeners have had anything like this happen, and how did they deal with it. I want to know how to tell if a person is dead or real. I know that sounds crazy. It's not like I can just go up and talk to everyone with my PTSD to see if they're real. I pretty much avoid people except those close to me or my friends from work. I'm working on that, and maybe I can find a way to be more like the person I used to be, and I'd be able to control it better. I can't see dead people on demand, tell the future, give a reading, or claim to have any psychic abilities. I simply see dead people and hear voices. I could be crazy, but I don't feel crazy, so I'm pretty sure that I'm mostly a normal person. LOL, I really just want to know how I tell the difference between a real person and a dead person. Maybe if I can learn the difference, I'll go up and try to have a chat with them. That last sentence makes me laugh, but I might try it, even if it does sound crazy. I apologize for the length. I've left a lot out in the interest of time, and if anyone out there can relate or has a suggestion, I'd love to hear about what you have to say. Thanks, Nick, for letting me tell my story. If anyone has experienced anything similar to what Michelle has, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you get in touch. As tonight's edition of Paranormal Mysteries comes to a close, I appreciate each and every one of you for listening, and a special thank you goes out to Randy and Michelle for sharing their experiences. And if you've encountered something unexplainable, you may contact me through email, voice message, or on our website via the links in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy rest of your week, and I'll see you back here on Friday as we uncover even more experiences involving paranormal mysteries. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host as always, Nick Ryan. On today's edition of From the Forest, I'll be talking about strange noises, bizarre creatures, and shadow people in the forest. But of course, before we start, I'd like to thank Anne for their support and generosity. And remember that anyone can show their support simply by sharing and reviewing the podcast. Or if you'd prefer to make a monetary contribution, you may do so through our patreon.com buymeacoffee.com, or PayPal donation links. Also, if you have a paranormal experience to share, you may contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And of course, all of our support and contact information can be found in the show notes. And with all that in mind, tonight's first encounter comes to us from The Naturalist, and their story is called Young's Memorial Cemetery. And the Naturalist says, "Hello, Nick and fellow listeners. Since 2012, I have been fortunate and determined enough to work in the environmental sector, with stints in environmental and outdoor education, ecological restoration, wildlife conservation, rare and endangered plant research, and urban agriculture. Nearly a decade of working outdoors in natural areas off limits to the general public has been humbling, but not without its share of unexplainable experiences. I've been listening for over a year and haven't heard a lot of other folks within this sector come forward. Maybe sharing my experiences will help others reevaluate things they may have experienced while out in the field that cannot be summarized by guiding principles of physics, hydrology, and ecology overall. It is why I am writing in under an alias, The Naturalist, as I do have some trepidation, but not enough to stay silent. In 2012, I got my first environmental education job at the Theodore Roosevelt Bird Sanctuary in Oyster Bay, New York, on Long Island. The sanctuary was founded by TR himself, with several original buildings that TR helped construct and design. The property is also home to Young's Memorial Cemetery, where members of the Long Island Roosevelt family are buried, as well as plenty of other folks. One of his daughters, Ethel Roosevelt, was a lifelong resident of Oyster Bay and died in 1977. I haven't seen any personally, but I always heard some rumors that folks would see her ghost around the places that she liked to frequent. My connection to this site extends beyond 2012, back to 1997. I was brought to the bird sanctuary side for public outreach programming, camps, and volunteering. During those years, I heard rumors of the place being haunted by Teddy Roosevelt and ghosts from the cemetery. But being an easily scared kid, I tried to not let those thoughts take over my brain, and tried to not call him Teddy because apparently he hated the nickname. Over the years attending the sanctuary, I experienced moments that I felt in time would be missing. I would get lost from the group and suddenly find myself completely disoriented and in an unfamiliar part of the sanctuary without much recollection for how I got there. There was even a few moments where I felt strange pulling to go to certain parts of the sanctuary, off trail by some kind of greater force or entity. There were times I felt something tickling me or pulling at my feet, causing me to fidget constantly, not to mention countless spooky moments while sitting in the bird blind out in the woods. Despite the strangeness, it was the place that cemented my desire to pursue a career outdoors. When I was hired to work at the sanctuary in 2012, it had been about 6 years since I had been on site, and everyone who worked there in 2012 was not working there when I attended as a child. As an adult, the site still had this incredible beauty and mystical, enchanting appearance to it, but now I could not shake the feeling of being watched wherever I went. The office, the bird blinds, locking the gates, taking out the trash to the dumpsters, and cleaning the animal enclosures. It was a constant feeling that would often result in a chill over my shoulders and down my back. The trails and pathways are heavily mulched with wood chips, and when I would leave my shift to walk out into the parking lot alone, there were many days where I would hear someone walking behind me. Sometimes I would smell an odd, smoky, old leather sort of smell. The site is only 14 acres total, including the cemetery, with 3 walking trails all next to each other, named the Upper Trail, the Middle Trail, and the Lower Trail. There are some paths and steep inclines that connect upper to middle, middle to lower, etc. The Upper Trail also curves and directly passes a portion of Young's Memorial Cemetery near the beginning, after a stand of conifers. There was a day when I was leading a hike along the Upper Trail, past a conifer stand, past the cemetery, past a meadow with a bench to what I can only describe as a sloping hill. There you are hiking downhill through a dense stand of deciduous trees. The trail neatly cuts right through the middle of this miniature valley with a steep decline to the side. The land here was heavily overgrown with English ivy, steeply sloped up until a property line fence, and beyond the trail it's considered off-limits for visitors and students. I had a great group of kids that day, around 8 to 10 years old, so they're at the age where they are learning how to push back against authority, critically questioning, but still motivated to participate in the group. The group had a great dynamic, and I never had much trouble from kids wandering off the trail and away from me. This time, while we were hiking, I got the feeling of being watched again. Usually the feeling always felt like it was behind me, but leading the way with 8 kids lined up hiking behind me, the feeling of being watched was coming from my right-hand side. It was so overwhelming that I stopped short and the child behind me just walked right into me. I apologized to them and said, "Let's count off," cueing the group to count off from 1 to 8. As a way of taking attendance while on the trail without having to stop and directly look at each person. They began to count 1, 2, 3, 4, then nothing. I immediately turned around on the narrow trail and saw that I was missing 4 students. The sense of sheer panic was truly primal. I loudly and firmly said, "Where are they? We need to stick together now. Let's go back." I might not be anyone's parent, but out on the trail, the well-being and safety of these children are my responsibility. I ran, shouting their names back down the way we came, with the 4 others following me closely. When we got back to the bottom of this hill on the trail, back into the thickly overgrown patch of English ivy, I saw the 4 kids walking up towards me. All at once they started shouting to me, "We saw a man. He was down here. We thought you went down there with him. We were following you. Weren't we supposed to go here? He was tall. He looked old. Where were you? He had a hat." The greatest feeling was seeing all of them there, unharmed, unafraid, just trying to convince me that they weren't in trouble. But the relief was short-lived, as I was ready to cry and take everyone back inside, ready to forget the afternoon's activity. Utterly shaken by the thought of them separated from the group, even if only for a few fleeting minutes, I looked down to where they said they went. I saw no man. I saw no adult-sized shoe prints in the soft, wet dirt on the footpath leading down the sloping hill. I saw nothing but densely grown trees on this downward slope with a carpet of English ivy over the ground. Who was he? And where did he go? Further down the hill, I knew there was a property-line fence that went up next to a large, multi-million-dollar privately owned home. There was no one standing by their side of the property-line fence. There never would be, but for it being the middle of July, I suddenly felt freezing. I was somehow able to collect myself and get us back on the hike to our final destination. During snack time later, I was able to ask some of the 4 kids a little more about why they went off trail, as part of a bigger conversation about the importance of staying with the group, staying where I can see them, etc. The 4 kids were insistent, adamant, that someone was down the side of the trail who waved them to come down. They said they thought they saw me down there with the rest of the group. One boy even said that he followed me down there to meet the man, again insistent that they only went down because they thought that it was okay. They thought they saw an adult wave them down. It was hard for me to process listening to them. Plainly put, I did no such thing, and I could not have led half the group hiking one way and leading the other half another. To give some greater context to the area, people don't just go walking around Long Island. It's a very car-centric place. There's a few sidewalks, especially around here. Also, this deeply interior part of the property is far from any sort of roadway. At this time, this part of Long Island didn't have white-tailed deer either, so truly the biggest thing we'd see naturally occurring on the trail is a turkey. Maybe a fox if we're lucky, but no bear, no coyotes, no large mammals. Lastly, the sanctuary has one way in and one way out. I didn't know what to say, how to explain this to my boss, or who to even tell about it. I mentioned it to my coworker briefly, and she looked surprised but also fully believed that any place this old would be haunted. 9 years later, I feel like I'm just processing it all for the first time. All this time, I really thought that it was a ghost of TR that was very much present on the site. Maybe he is, but TR isn't the only Roosevelt buried in Young's cemetery. In fact, therein lies a tragedy from what I can tell. Theodore, Edith, and only 2 of their children, Ethel and Archie, are buried there. All the other Roosevelt children are buried in Alaska, Washington, and even Normandy, France. It's only while typing this that my heart feels inexplicably heavy. The site is only 1.5 miles from Sagamore Hill, the Long Island Roosevelt family compound, where the Roosevelt children famously spent a lot of quality time as children with their parents. I ponder if the site remains so active in part because how much they loved each other. How much energy must that love have created? Where does that energy go? Maybe they feel a little bit like how I felt on the trail leading the hike, walking forward, suddenly aware of feeling behind them that it was too quiet, only to turn around and look for the children in my hiking group. Are Edith and Archie looking for their siblings? Are Theodore and Edith looking for the rest of the Roosevelts? Do they all feel like they have been separated on the trail too? It has been nearly a decade since I had the humble privilege of working at this site. Many cosmetic changes and native species restoration projects have taken place since then, including the removal of carpets on non-native English ivy. But the Roosevelt Bird Sanctuary has endured these changes and remains an incredible example of conservation. I hope to return there someday, whether it be professionally or as a patron. But next time I'll bring some native wildflowers, and I think I'll climb those 26 steps to properly pay my respects to the 26th president, our former First Lady Edith, Ethel, and Archie. I sincerely thank you for taking the time to read my experience. I'll be sure to write back with more tales from the field, forest, and lab. The Naturalist. Our next story of the evening comes to us from Annabelle, and Annabelle's story is called Strange Noises. Annabelle says, "Hey Nick, I've written before and decided to share another story. This one is set in Colorado in a house that my family was renting for a while. One day I was sitting in a room in the basement making beaded bracelets and listening to music. I was enjoying myself, which I rarely did up there, and I decided to open the window to let the breeze in. An ad from the music app I was using started playing, so I turned the volume down. I was listening to the breeze through the trees when I started hearing a strange noise from the woods. It sounded like whale sounds, so I was wondering if my brother in the room over had music going, and I was just hearing that. So I walked over to his room and I asked if he had heard the noise too. He said that he thought it was me. At this point I was freaked out, so I went outside to see if I could hear it better, and sure enough I did. It sounded like a very large animal groaning in pain. It was a deep rumbling, and it faded in and out, as if it was moving away. At this point, I ran upstairs to tell my mom. She thought I was crazy, and I took her outside to listen. We then heard one last faint groan, until it completely faded. I think about this often as it was a very strange experience. Thanks for having a place to share our stories. I love your podcast. Annabelle." Our next experience comes to us from Derek, and Derek's experience is called Half Leprechaun, Half Goat, and Creature at Salt Springs Reservoir. Derek says, "Hey Nick, I want to thank you for sharing my story on your podcast about my possible alien abduction on episode 229. To this day, whatever happened that night, whether it be a dream or reality, I still think it was real. I have 2 stories to share with you today. The first one happened a long time ago, probably in the late 80s or early 90s. I was in Modesto, California, at what I think was either my grandma's house or my aunt's house. I can't remember whose house it was. We lived in a country setting where your closest neighbor was a mile or so away. It was dark and dinner time, so I think it was around the fall when it gets dark earlier. My brother and I were sent outside to the back to get something for dinner. There was a fridge or freezer under an open shed. It had a roof but only 2 walls, one in the back and one on the side. There were small shrubs in front of this area where the fridge or freezer was for decoration. Thinking back now, they were probably little box bushes, about knee height to my adult size now. When we went outside, we saw these glowing red eyes, like when you shine a light on cat eyes, but they were red, and my brother, trying to scare me, said it was a gremlin or something. At that second of him saying that, the little creature growled at us, almost sounding like the baby Simba growl, but just a little bit deeper, but not by much. We were both scared and yelled for our mom and grandma, and when they did this, the creature ran behind the little box bushes, and we turned the light on that was over the shed thing where the fridge or freezer was. It created a silhouette of the creature, and it looked like a leprechaun, but from the waist down, it had a goat's body, and it ran on 2 legs. By this time, our mom and grandma were outside, and one of my uncles saw it. They told us to get inside, and my uncle grabbed a shotgun to go after it, but it was already gone. For the life of me, I forgot the name my grandma called it, but it reminded me now of the little critters on your previous podcast that like to play tricks on people for their own enjoyment. I never saw that little thing after that. My next story takes place about 8 years ago at Salt Springs Reservoir in California. My wife and I were camping there with our son and his friend and our niece. It was the last day of camping, and we just got done eating dinner, and we were all sitting next to the fire roasting marshmallows. As I was packing up our stuff into our minivan, I noticed 2 glowing eyes and thought it was a deer at first, but then realized that deer eyes aren't in front of their faces like a human. This animal, or whatever it was, had the predator set eyes in front, so I assumed that maybe it was a bear. So we all started making as much noise as we could to scare it off, and all it did was crouch down and turn its head. It did eventually leave, but in the morning we thought that this thing was on a hill because it was pitch black out the night before. However, the morning light showed us that it was actually a pretty level area where we were. So, this thing's eyes were probably 10 feet high. After listening to your previous podcast about the dogman, it makes me think that maybe this was a dogman or something. Whatever it wasn't a deer or bear or any other local wildlife. Thank you for taking the time to read my stories, and again, keep up the good work, and I love the podcast. Derek. Our next story of the night comes to us from Sarah, and Sarah's story is called My Experience with Shadow People in the Woods. Sarah says, Hey Nick, I found your podcast in February of last year, right before the world shut down due to the pandemic. I've been interested in the paranormal for as long as I can remember, and that interest was fueled by my mother, who has also had a lifelong interest as well. I binged every episode of the podcast that was out, up until the point in February of 2020, when I found it over the course of about 5 days. I couldn't get enough, so I actually became a patron to have early access to episodes. I've thought about writing in with this story many times over the last year and a half, but finally decided to do it tonight. Please accept my advanced apology for the lengthiness of it. I grew up in the tiny town of Faith, North Carolina, in a subdivision that was once all farmland. It was aptly named Faith Farms. It was surrounded by woods, and the woods on the north side of the neighborhood bordered what was left of the farmland that wasn't sold off. From what I remember being told, the original farmer's great-great-great, or something along those lines, grandson now owned what was left. The woods in that area had an entire network of trails running through it that were wide enough for a car to drive down. We used to always joke that they were made for horses and buggies, and we honestly may not have been wrong. There was also a creek that all of us neighbor kids would play in year-round. It was deep enough in some places that we could actually wade in and float. For Christmas, when I was around 10 to 12 years old, I got a brand new purple mountain bike that I had been wanting. The day after Christmas, I rode my bike door to door to try and get one of my friends to come bike on the trails with me. I ended up going alone because everyone was either busy, not home, or under the weather. This didn't bother me, as I frequently spent time in those woods by myself, either playing in the creek, finding hidden places and cool hangout spots, looking for rocks, or trying to build a clubhouse, etc. I rode my bike down the trail that led to the wide spot in the creek we liked to float in and catch crawdads during the summer. I remember wanting to see if there was ice along the edges of the part that pools. This was down a fairly large hill, and I remember almost wrecking as I was coming down because my tires slipped on the leaves when I hit my brakes to keep from going too fast, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to ride my bike back up. I leaned my bike against a tree and proceeded to poke around the banks of the creek. My back was turned to the trail. As I'm bent down poking at the icy edges of the creek with a stick, I hear a whistle and then some leaves rustle up near the top of the hill. I turn around but don't see anything, so I continue to poke around. A short while later, I hear the whistle again, but this time it sounds closer. I look up the trail again and see nothing. I suddenly notice that the whole part of the woods I'm in has basically gone silent. It's quiet in the woods in winter there because most of the animals have either migrated or are hibernating, but there's definitely still ambient noise and some animals making sounds. The only thing I could hear after the second whistle was the creek quietly bubbling. The hair on the back of my neck raises, and I start to feel as if I'm being watched and decide it's probably time to go. I stand up and wipe my hands off on my jeans, and I grab my bike. I begin pushing it up the hill. The hill is pretty steep, so as I'm pushing, I'm looking down while my hands are on each handlebar, and I'm digging in my feet with each step, and also trying not to slip on leaves. After a bit, I look up to see how much farther I have to get to the top. There's a large tree on the right side of the trail, and what I saw there still pops into my nightmares from time to time. When I look up, I see a shadowy figure put a round yet pointy arm on the side of the tree facing me, and then lean its rounded head around the trunk. I later saw a figure so similar in the movie Howl's Moving Castle later in life that I have to skip that scene when I watch it now. I will attach a photo of it to this email. My blood felt like it turned to ice, and I was frozen in fear. The figure leaned back around behind the tree, and then another does the same thing from behind a smaller tree on the left side of the trail, and continues to stare at me. My flight instinct kicked in when I saw that figure step a leg out from behind the tree, as if it was going to come towards me. I bolted off the left side of the trail and ran toward the tree line that ran parallel to it, dragging my bike with me. I did not look back, but I heard 2 more whistles in what sounded like a call and response type thing. By the time I reached the trail line, I had tears streaming down my face from the pure fear and panic that I felt. I crawled under the lowest point of the barbed wire fence and then dragged my bike through as fast as I could. I then hopped on the bike, and I never in my life pedaled home as fast as I did that day. I tried to tell my dad what I I saw, but he of course chalked it up to a kid's imagination, and my mind playing tricks on me. After this incident, I never went into that part of the woods alone again. 2 other kids in the neighborhood also had similar experiences while together about a month later. All of us eventually felt too creeped out to play there anymore. Sorry again for this being so long-winded. When I tell a story, I just like to paint the whole picture so you can see it in your mind. I do have a few other experiences I'd like to share, if you'd like to hear them. Thanks again for giving folks a safe space to share their experiences. Sometimes just having a place to talk about them freely and without judgment makes them less intimidating to think about. Warm regards, Sarah. As tonight's edition of From the Forest comes to a close, I appreciate all of you for listening, and a special thank you goes out to The Naturalist, Annabelle, Derek, and Sarah for sharing their experiences. And if you've had a paranormal experience that occurred in or near the forest, you may contact me through email, voice message, or on our website, and these links can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy rest of the week, and I'll see you back here on Friday as we uncover more experiences involving paranormal mysteries.
Family. It looks a little different for everyone. For some, it's mom and dad. For others, roommates who feel like family. And for others, it's your significant other, their golfing buddies, your children, a high school soccer team starting lineup, and oh look, they're all taking you up on the offer to stay for dinner, really testing the limits of that phrase, the more the merrier. But no matter where you call home, Geico makes it easy to bundle and save on home and car insurance. Easier than making 3 frozen pizzas and assorted frozen veggies into a cohesive meal.
At Firehouse Subs, a portion of every purchase helps provide life-saving equipment to first responders. We make our subs differently because our subs can make a difference. Like our fan-favorite Turkey Bacon Ranch, piled high with tender smoked turkey breast, crispy bacon, melted sharp cheddar cheese, and drizzled with creamy peppercorn ranch. And it's only at Firehouse Subs. Click the banner now to start your pickup or delivery order.
Thank you for joining me, and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, I'll be covering shadow people, men in black, reincarnation, a ghost investigation at Camp Floyd in Fairfield, Utah, and much more. But before we start, I'd like to thank everyone for their support and generosity. And remember that anybody can show their support by sharing and reviewing the podcast, as well as visiting us at patreon.com or buymeacoffee.com. And if you have a paranormal experience to share, you may contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And all of our information can be found in the show notes. And now, let's start the show with our first listener story of the night. which comes to us from Sasha. And Sasha says, "Hi Nick, I'm from Fairway, Kansas, and I love your podcast, and I have a paranormal experience to share with you. On a Friday in June this summer, I was riding home from the village, which was a small shopping strip in my town. It was about 10 p.m. roughly, and I received a text from my friend who was asking when I would be able to get on Xbox. I was on my bike in the Fairway Pool parking lot, and the parking lot was fairly lit up, and I could see perfectly fine. While I was texting with my friend, my phone turned off randomly, and not 1 second later, one of the lights that lit up the parking lot turned off. At this point, I was on edge, not because of my phone and not because of the light, but because of how fast it all happened. My phone at the time was an iPhone 6, and it was way overdue for an upgrade, so it was not unusual that my phone would glitch out like this. But about 30 seconds after that light turned off, 4 Ford Explorers pulled into the parking lot. At first I thought they were cops, but it was weird because the cars were all black. I was on edge because 4 cops had just pulled into the parking lot that I was in, but then they parked, and after watching them park, my heart dropped. The way that the cars pulled in was identical down to the way that the cars turned off. I waited and watched as the cars just sat there, and I was there waiting for what felt like an eternity. After a few minutes, the car doors opened, and all the vehicles had one parking spot in between them. The doors all opened at the same time, and 2 men came out of each car. One of the men walked up to me and got roughly 5 feet away from me and stopped and said 2 words. "Go home." I was so scared that I just stood there on my bike for a minute or 2. After I stood there, I just left and rode my bike a few blocks to my house. But the scariest part were the men. They were all wearing nice suits, and they were all very tall. I am 6'2", and when the man walked up to me, he towered over me by at least a foot. And his face was snow white. He had no hair anywhere on his body, and his voice was extremely deep and mechanical. When he talked to me, he did not look at me, but over me, and he did not blink once or make eye contact. The other 7 men all stood at the side of the cars, and they all looked identical to the man who talked to me, and none of them moved the entire time. For some reason, the scariest part was their lips. They were bright red, and they were the only color on them. Once I left and got home, I took a shower and went to bed, and I didn't tell anybody until I told my dad a week later. I am not really a superstitious person, but this was something else. Sorry for the long story, but I hope you can use it. Our next experience of the night comes to us from Heaven, and Heaven's story is called A Reminder from a Friend. And Heaven says, "Hi Nick, I have been listening to your podcast for a few months now, and it helps me get through working out or doing easy work at my job. I have had several paranormal experiences. However, I have only felt and heard paranormal things. I have never actually seen anything like a spirit, ghost, etc. This story I'm going to tell you about today was either a creepy coincidence or definitely something paranormal. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a car dealership in the Arlington area of Texas while I was going to college full-time. I loved my job working in the office there and made many friends with my coworkers of all ages. One friend in particular was a man in his 50s who was a service writer at the dealership. There was definitely an age gap, but we got along so well and really considered each other friends. It almost felt like we knew each other from a different life. We worked together for 3 years before he quit to go to another dealership, and I ended up moving back to Wisconsin, where I'm originally from, shortly after he left. Before I took the long drive to Wisconsin from Texas, I stopped by at his new dealership to have lunch with him and say goodbye, because I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. After moving back to Wisconsin, we stayed in touch and texted every once in a while. One day, about 3 years after I moved back to Wisconsin, I received a message from my old boss at the dealership telling me that he had passed away from a massive heart attack. I was so sad. He was a really great person. He was fairly healthy and, as mentioned before, in his 50s, which I would consider young still, so everyone was shocked. I felt extremely sad for his wife, who posted on Facebook multiple times after his passing about how heartbroken she was and how much she missed him. I saw all of these posts because I was friends with him on Facebook. A few days after he passed, I saw a red cardinal out my kitchen window, sitting on the fence. I had a thought that it was him, but didn't think too much of it. Why would he visit me of all people anyway? We were just friends. Years have gone by, and I still think of him. Well, a few weeks ago, I was at work on our manufacturing floor by myself on a nice relaxing Friday, listening to your podcast as I worked. Every time someone writes in with something along the lines of, "I'm not sure if this is a good paranormal story, etc., I always think if my stories are worthy enough to write in. As I was listing all of my paranormal experiences in my head, I briefly thought of my friend being the red cardinal, but I brushed it off because what can I really say about that, right? I saw a red cardinal out my window that could have been my friend. Great story, not. Plus, I have way better experiences than that. Nonetheless, it is still a bit paranormal to me, so in my head I'm thinking, I wouldn't really consider that my paranormal experience, and I moved on thinking of my other ones. About an hour later, I'm still listening to the podcast, still working on what I was doing, and then I get a notification on my phone that I have a friend request on Facebook. I looked at my lock screen, and it was from him. Not only am I already friends with him on Facebook, but how can he send me a friend request in the first place? I then unlocked my phone and went to Facebook to see if it was really his normal page or if it was a hacker, but the notification wasn't there on Facebook. It only popped up on my lock screen. How can that be? I checked it moments after it popped up, and it disappeared. It was crazy. I told some of my coworkers, and they were creeped out. Can that really be a coincidence? Or was my friend reminding me that he really was the one that visited me as the Red Cardinal that day? Our next story of the evening comes to us from Adam, and Adam's story is called The Dude. Adam says, "When I was a kid, we lived in a small house out in the country. The house was built by my great-granddad. In the back of the house, there was a small hallway where my room, my sister's room, and the bathroom were. My room and the bathroom were on other sides of the hallway facing each other, and my sister's was in the middle of the hallway. Almost every night, you could see a shadow man with a hat walking into my room, and 5 minutes later, walk from my room to the bathroom, back and forth. One night, I remember waking up and seeing a shadow staring at me in the doorway. I ran into my mom's room and slept in there for the night, and about an hour later I was woken up by my sister, crying and saying that there was a man staring at her at the end of her bed. Neither of us talked about it, but saw the same thing. We saw him so much that we called him the Dude. Every time he would enter one of our rooms, we would run into my mom's room and say, 'We saw the Dude in our rooms.' When I got older, my mom told us a story about her seeing the Dude. My dad used to snore really bad, and my mom would wake him up to sleep on the couch some nights. She said that she woke up and went into the living room and saw a light on outside the front porch. She went out and saw a man standing with a hat and overalls on, looking out into the yard. She thought it was my dad and started saying, 'It's 1 a.m. Get in the house and go to sleep.' She said the man looked at her, shrugged, and then turned back to the yard. She yelled my dad's name, and then my dad's voice, which came from the living room, shouted, 'What?' She turned and looked at him, and then looked back at the guy outside, and he was gone. She said the man was wearing the same thing as my great-granddad always wore. The same clothes as the Dude wears. Back in 2014, my dad passed away from brain cancer, and ever since he passed, there were no more signs of the Dude. But every time I step into my old house, I always get a very eerie feeling. Thanks for letting me tell my story, and keep up the good work. Adam." Our next experience of the night comes to us from S.A., and S.A.'s story is called Reincarnation Story. S.A. says, "Hi Nick, I'm a new fan and your podcast is terrifying. My story isn't scary, but it isn't one I normally share because I don't want my friends or family to think differently of me. Back when I was in college, I started meditating to deal with my stress, but also because I thought the meditations were a ton of fun. Some were strange and esoteric, like meditations to see the future, or meditations to turn your eyes blue. I thought these were entertaining and would try them out from time to time, even though I didn't believe that they worked. I eventually tried a meditation tape that would supposedly allow you to see your past life. I didn't believe in past lives, but I tried it, and I saw something incredibly vivid. I was a gawky-looking woman with a long nose, and I was wearing a black dress with a bonnet and an apron. I was walking on a cobblestone lane, and there were short houses all around me, and I got the sense that this was my neighborhood because I saw a few people that I knew, including my husband, a shoemaker. I saw myself playing with a little girl in a meadow, and I sensed that she was like a daughter to me, though not my actual daughter. Later, I saw my home burning down, and everyone around me screamed and ran away from the fire. But I stood still and watched it, feeling like everything in the world was about to change. I remember feeling it was the worst day of my life, and then I was on my deathbed. I had long, distinct silver hair, and the little girl I knew had grown up, and she was sitting at the end of my bed. This was the most vivid part, and to this day, if I think about it too clearly, I cry, because all I wanted was to tell her that I didn't want to leave her, that I loved her, and wanted to stay. But I couldn't speak because I was dying at that very moment. I know this is a long email already, but there's more to the story. For several years before and after the meditation regression, I had a fascination for Hans Christian Andersen. I hadn't read any of his stories, but I was inexplicably drawn to him as a person, and had wanted to read a biography about him for years, but had never gotten around to doing it. Well, after a year or two after the meditation, I finally bought a biography about Hans Christian Andersen, thinking nothing about it. In the first few chapters, the author gave brief backgrounds on his family members, including his paternal grandmother. She was married to a shoemaker, and she had long, distinct silver hair. But I didn't notice these things until I read that her house burned down, and that was the worst day of her life. It was like someone had struck a gong inside my head. The whole world reverberated around me. I hadn't suspected at all that I would find a clue to my past life in that book. I know it seems like very little evidence to link my regression to this woman's life, but it isn't the evidence that convinces me. I felt a physical change when I read about the fire which burned down her home. My head was pounding, and I couldn't breathe. I would have fallen over from dizziness if I hadn't already been sitting. That's the story, and I'm now a firm believer in past lives. Thank you for reading, and thank you in advance if you decide to share my story on the show. Our next listener story of the night comes to us from Tyler, and Tyler's story is called Ghost Investigation at Camp Floyd in Fairfield, Utah. Tyler says, "To start off, I love the podcast. Last summer I spent every day at work listening to every episode, and every moment was worth it. This past Saturday I had the amazing opportunity to go to Camp Floyd State Park, which is located in Fairfield, Utah. The history of this place is quite interesting indeed. For a brief history of this place, it was originally an army outpost during the mid-1800s. The troops were sent there over the rumors about the Mormons taking over the country. While they were there, many soldiers died off due to cold weather and sickness. This all makes this place a high paranormal activity location. At the beginning of the investigation, we went over and talked about the hottest spots for activity, how to take pictures to find spirits, etc. So we were off to split up and investigate. For this night, I brought along both dowsing rods and a K2 meter, and both worked very well. The most exciting part of the night, however, was when I was in the Stagecoach Inn on the top floor in a bedroom. I started off with my dowsing rods, asking simple yes or no questions. If the answer to my question was yes, the rods would cross. If no, the rods would spread apart. As I was doing this and felt the connection at the end of the rods, I looked down to my K2 meter, and it was spiking all the way to red. At this moment, I was getting really excited along with everyone else. As we did this, the meter turned itself off as we brought all attention to it. I put my hand down to touch the meter, and the atmosphere around it was super thick and really cold. After this, we brought the spirit box into the room, in which I asked, "Can you communicate through this?" And as soon as I said this, a female voice came through that said, "Yes, I can." All this made me super excited, and this alone was just part of the night, and there were many more things that happened that were amazing. This was a firm confirmation that there are indeed spirits here on Earth, and there is definitely something after death. Where we end up all depends on the lifestyle and choices we make in life. I encourage you to all get out and explore. Just be careful with what you're using and what you're messing with. The last thing you wouldn't want is a spirit attachment to torment you. With this being said, I'll definitely consider submitting again, as I do have some experiences with sleep paralysis. I thank you for reading this, and would really appreciate it if you put it on the podcast. Sincerely, Tyler. Tyler included a very interesting video of their dowsing rod session, and I'll be sure to add it to our forum, and you can find a link to it in the show notes. Our next experience comes to us from Josh, and Josh's story is called Sleep Paralysis or Something Else. Josh says, "Hey Nick, I figured I would write in with some more experiences of mine. I have heard similar things happening to other people on this podcast, so I feel like I can talk about them here, which is good as I can finally get them off my chest. During my teen years, I had a number of frightening experiences after we moved to a new town in another state. I would go to bed pretty late as I would always stay up playing video games, but then I would wake up later. This isn't like waking all the way up. You think you are awake and then realize that you aren't, and you try to wake up again, but can't. Anyway, when this would happen, a large black mass, like a swirling vortex, would appear next to my bed on the wall, or sometimes a shadow in the shape of a person at the foot of my bed. Either way, it would feel as if this being or entity would begin to suck something like my soul out of my body. I could never move. I could only just lay there petrified and terrified, praying to Jesus that this thing would go away. This seemed to work, as after what seemed like a really long time, light would come from somewhere and this thing would disappear. After that, I would wake up drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. It was always difficult to go back to sleep. These things would not happen too frequently, maybe like 2 to 3 times a year, but it happened enough that I would always be at least a little hesitant to call it a night and hit the sack in that house. It's probably half the reason I would try to stay up until the early morning hours, playing video games. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this kind of stuff, and I hope you are doing well. Josh. Our next experience of the night comes to us from Rose, and Rose's story is called Woman in the Door and a Reassuring Dream. Rose says, "Hi Nick, I just discovered your podcast a couple weeks ago during a 12-hour car ride home, and I have listened to it nonstop since. I have 2 very different stories, one which occurred when I was maybe 5 or 6, and I'm 26 now, and one that happened quite literally last night and into this morning. I'll start with the first story. When I was about 5 or 6, as I mentioned, I was asleep in my bedroom at my childhood home, which is now 3 houses ago. When you walk up the stairs and go right, my bedroom was the corner room at the very end of a long hall. My older brother's room was adjacent to mine, but my parents' room was at the very opposite end, to the left. My bed was positioned so that if you are to sit up in bed, you are perfectly centered, looking at the door across from you. I slept with my bedroom door open, which at night meant that I would just have a completely pitch-black hallway to look at if I woke up. One night I was asleep, but woke up abruptly from a bad dream, which I do not remember. I sat up in my bed and looked at my bedroom door and into the hall. Standing in my doorway was an elderly woman with dark and short hair, wearing a nightgown which looked identical to my grandmother's nightgown. I remember being a bit afraid, but more confused, as I thought that it was my grandmother who lived, and still does live now as a 95-year-old, in Arizona, and we live in Chicago. I stared at her and she just smiled. I said, "Grandma?" even though I knew it couldn't be her, and she just kept smiling. I began to feel more and more scared, and I called out for my dad. After the third time I called for my dad, and the woman was still standing there, I could hear my dad's footsteps getting closer and closer to my bedroom. Just before my dad reached my room, the woman looked down the hall at where my dad was walking from, then looked back at me and put her finger over her mouth in a shh motion, and then disappeared. Quite literally 1 second later, my dad entered my room. I explained to him what had happened, but as a 5 or 6-year-old who often had bad dreams, my dad told me it was just a dream and to try to go back to sleep. I fell back asleep, only to be awoken up a couple hours later by the sound of something scratching vigorously underneath my bed. Too afraid to move, I called out for my dad yet again. The scratching continued as I waited for my dad, and the moment he entered my room, the scratching stopped. My dad turned on my light, searched underneath my bed, in my closet, and checked outside my windows, even though we were on the 2nd floor, which was high up. He found nothing, but based on my fear, he let me sleep in between he and my mom the rest of the night. I still don't know what it was, or why the woman in my doorway looked so much like my grandmother, but nothing like that has happened since then. But even at age 26 now, I think about it all the time. My next story is on the more light-hearted side. Yesterday I was listening to an episode of the podcast on my way home from work, as I always do now. The episode was based on several stories from listeners where they have dreams that almost seem to predict the future. Anyway, my cousin had her first baby last November 2020. He was born extremely premature, at just over 1 pound. He has been in the NICU for 11 months now, and we never really knew at what point he would be coming home. Last night I had a dream that I was driving to work, and my cousin was sitting in the front passenger seat with me. It was just the two of us, and all I said to her in the dream was, "You look so healthy and happy ever since you had the baby." That was literally the entire dream. This morning on my way to work, my mom texted me that my cousin and her husband were bringing home the baby today after 11 months in the NICU, and today happens to be his 11-month birthday. I immediately remembered my dream from the previous night and got chills up and down my whole body. Maybe it was just a crazy coincidence, but based on other listener stories, I'd like to think it was a comforting sign that their baby would be home soon. Thank you for taking the time to read both stories, and I can't wait to continue listening to your podcast. Take care. Rose. As we bring tonight's episode to an end, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Sasha, Heaven, Adam, S.A., Tyler, Josh, and of course Rose, for sharing all of their experiences. And if you've witnessed something paranormal, I'd like to hear your story. You may contact me through email, voice message, or on our website via the links in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Wednesday as we continue our journey into the unexplained, right here on Paranormal Mysteries.
Follow your team anytime, anywhere with Contour TV and the Contour app from Cox. Plus, use the voice remote to search for games or record one that starts past bedtime. Because even a 24/7 fan's gotta sleep sometime. Learn more at cox.com/sports.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Wait a minute. I've heard that before. That's the note Jeremy wrote to me in my yearbook in the 6th grade. How'd you even know that?
Because it's from Geico.
Yeah, wait, here it is. Dear Luke, have a great summer. P.S. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. Love, Jeremy.
Geico's had this tagline for years, because we help save people money.
So wait, you're saying Jeremy copied you? Yeah, that actually does sound like something the J-Man would do.
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Thank you for joining me and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, I'll be talking about a haunted house, a murdered spirit, a paranormal concierge, a picture of a ghost, and much more. But of course, before we start, I'd like to thank Glenda, Serenity, and Jean-Francois for their support and generosity. And remember that anyone can show their support by sharing and reviewing the podcast, or if you'd prefer to make a monetary contribution, you may do so through our patreon.com, buymeacoffee.com, or PayPal donation links. And if you have a paranormal experience to share with me, you may contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through our voice message system at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or of course on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And all of our support and contact information can be found in the show notes. And now let's start the show with our first story of the night, which comes to us from Joe. And Joe's story is called Paranormal Concierge. Joe says, "Hi Nick, I promised I would send in more stories, so here is one from earlier in 1990. It started when I accepted a position as a patient care tech in a long-term care facility. I was pretty experienced by this time in my career and this particular assignment. Back in the day, most of the time, the male staff was limited to the male residents. This day, I was introduced to a quadriplegic and a new resident named Mr. J. We soon became pretty close, as you sometimes do in this field of care, and as we did, he became more comfortable with personal subjects and conversations. We often talked about our lives, hopes, and dreams. I worked the 3 to 11 shift, and no matter what was planned or scheduled for that shift, it began with first stopping in to say hello. Working this shift for most was always kind of eerie and could be very creepy at times if you were not used to it. This night I started off my shift as usual. As I looked down the wing where Mr. J was located, I noticed that he had a family member visiting as I saw a tall figure enter his room, so I stopped and turned around as to not disturb this quality time. Later that shift, when I made my rounds and my way to his room, I was met with a different resident than the normally always cheerful Mr. J. The energy was very different and strange, and I knew something was on. This on is a feeling that comes over me when spirits are present. It starts with a tingle and then a flush of emotions, sights, and sounds. As I stood beside his bed, I saw a dark figure in the corner near the window. It just looked at us. Although I couldn't see any details or features, I could clearly see the outline of a tall man-shaped mass about 6 feet tall. I am what I call a trained observer, as I have had my share of encounters with the paranormal. I mention this because I noticed his interaction with this dark figure as he switched his gaze, darting between both the figure and me. I could see that he was saddened, but not really scared. I assured him that I was there for him, and he thanked me. But what he said to me next caught me off guard, to say the least. He first thanked me for our time together, but he continued to tell me that he was passing on and would not be here when I got in the next day. Even though I was shocked, I somehow believed him because of what I had just witnessed. He could see that I had so many questions, but before I could ask, he said, "I can't tell you or talk about it." He told me that he was not afraid, and I believed him. I stayed with him as long as I could, and visited him throughout my shift. The following day, I called myself being smarter than the situation, and I came in 2 hours earlier, determined to be there if and when it was his time. When I passed the nursing station that led to the wing, I was met by a staff member who gave me the news that he was already gone. My eyes swelled as it was hard holding back my emotions. I turned to leave the building, heading back the way I entered. I was immediately pulled back towards his empty room, which was being stripped as per procedure when someone has passed. As I was about to enter the room, things turned on once again, and I felt that familiar tingle. Before I could recover and gather myself, I saw him sitting there on the side of his bed, his feet dangling, and he was swinging them back and forth. His face had a huge smile and a look of wonderment. My eyes never left him as he slowly faded away. I think back and I realize that he was happy that he was about to take his first step. Keep doing what you do. Joe. Our next story of the evening comes to us from Peggy, and Peggy's story is called Murdered Spirit with a Message. Peggy says, I work as a rehabilitation counselor with blind and deaf individuals. I was at work when a coworker came in that morning, upset because someone she knew had been hit by a car and killed after going out the night before. I was heading to see a client that I worked with. She lived in public housing, a small one-bedroom cluttered apartment. Faith was extremely hard of hearing and didn't wear hearing aids. She could hear very loud noises, but not speech. She was also legally blind and kept the lights dimmed as the glare hurt her eyes. She was also in a wheelchair. Faith communicates by speaking and having others write or type their answers in big letters so that she can read it. The day I arrived, she was so upset. She said that a good friend of hers had been killed in a car accident. She said she knew this woman from karaoke nights at a local bar. This woman had been her friend, and she had very few close friends, and she didn't believe that it was an accident. She thought that she had been killed. This woman's photo was on her computer screen, which I was about to use to type to her to continue our conversation. Just as she told me about the woman who had died, and said that she thought that she had been murdered, a lamp that was sitting next to the computer flew off the desk. I grabbed it mid-flight and looked around to see if I had hit the cord or if the cord had been pulled. Faith was sitting on the other side of the desk, nowhere near the lamp or the cord. I placed it back on the desk and started to type to Faith to explain what had happened. She continued to talk about the woman, and the lamp again flew off the desk. This time the plug which was under the desk came right out of the wall and was bent from the force. There was no physical cause for the lamp to move. I picked it up again and tried to explain what happened. Faith couldn't see what had happened due to her poor vision, and she just shook her head when I explained. Faith saw something go flying, but didn't seem to comprehend what had happened, even after I, shocked, tried to explain. I felt like the woman who had died was communicating, saying, yes, Faith is right. It was a homicide, not an accident. I wanted to tell the police, but what would I say? The dead woman communicated with us, and the case needed to be investigated? After my work was finished with Faith for the day, I left with such a strong feeling that this woman was trying to communicate with us. There was no other explanation. I did tell my coworker when I returned to the office, and she was shocked. I don't know what happened with the case, but I will never forget the incident. Our next story of the night comes to us from Chrissy, and Chrissy's story is called A Goodbye from My Soulmate from Beyond. Chrissy says, Hi Nick, it's so nice to be able to tell my story. I met my fiancé by fate. He lived in a different state while going to college. This was in 2001 when I was in my younger years, when we met a couple of boys that were cruising town, and they invited us to a party about an hour away from our home. When we went to this party, we were then invited to a party in Indianapolis, and this is where I met my fiancé. We dated for a year before he proposed, and we saw each other every weekend. Distance had nothing on us. We were that couple that everyone wanted to have. We loved each other endlessly, and we both knew that we were going to grow old together. Christmas was coming up, and we had just bought our first home with some help from my parents, and he had just graduated college, all within 1 month. So after he graduated, my mom and I took a truck to Indianapolis and gathered his things, and we started our lives. He had a job interview the day after Christmas, and I had just gotten the job of my dreams. We had it all. We were happy and in love. I had a son that was biologically not my fiancé's, but I met him while I was pregnant, and he took over as my son's father, even at such a young age. This brings us up to the day of Christmas Eve. He wanted to drive home and see his family for Christmas Eve, and he would be home in time for our son that was a baby at this time to open up presents. He drove my parents' car because they had a very nice luxury car that was comfortable. I kissed him goodbye, and he left. This is so hard for me to talk about, but I'm pushing through it. That night, when he was gone, I could not sleep. He was supposed to arrive back home at 2 a.m. Christmas morning. Like I said, I couldn't sleep, and the baby kept waking up, so I put him in bed with me, and every time I woke up I kept checking the couch to see if maybe he decided to sleep there so that he wouldn't bother us in bed. But nothing. Every time I woke up I worried more and more until I got the worst feeling all throughout my body, and I saw my fiancé come to me in my dream. His arms were closed in front of his face, and his head was down. He was crying uncontrollably, and he would not speak. He just cried and sobbed. I told him that whatever it was, that we could get through it. It felt so real, and it immediately woke me up. When I woke up, I noticed that I had a scratch from the middle of my forehead that went down all the way to my ear, which was odd because we didn't have any animals. At 7 a.m., my dad pulled up in the driveway, and I was scared because he wasn't home yet, and I thought that my dad was going to be very mad. But I knew something was wrong when he walked in the door. He informed me that the police had been to his house in the very early morning hours, wondering who was driving their car. They even made my brother get up and come downstairs just to make sure it wasn't him, because they could not find identification for my fiancé. He had driven 3.5 hours home, and 20 minutes from home, he fell asleep and wrecked into a very large telephone pole. I did not realize until the end of the day that when I woke up when he came to me in my dream, it was 2 a.m. 2:01 was his time of death, and he had been cut from the middle of his forehead down to his ear. But he was cut down to his brain. This all seemed so surreal to me. How could this be real? We had just bought a home. We had just started our lives. And we just had a baby. To this day, I've never been so devastated in all my life. I have carried this depression around with me to this very day. Life has not been easy without him, but I am so blessed to have known such a wonderful, caring, and loving man. I don't remember much after my dad came to inform me. The brain has a weird way of blocking trauma. I'm glad that he came to say goodbye at the very least, and I still feel him near me all the time. Thank you so much for taking the time to read my story. This was not easy for me to write, but I felt like it needed to be shared. I am a bit of an empath, so when he's around I feel it, and I can also feel other people's pain and moods. No one deserves to go through what I went through and what he went through. It changed me as a person entirely. I really hope that I'm able to listen to you read my story on your podcast. Thank you so much for this platform and the chance to tell my story. Our next story of the night comes to us from Kelly, and Kelly's story is called A Picture of a Ghost. Kelly says, "Hi Nick, I'm from Texas. I'd like to preface this by telling you what a great job you've been doing. It's amazing that you've created this platform for everyone to share their stories without any judgment. Keep up the great work, and thank you so much for what you've done for us. Now, I have a story to share with you. My mother and I had to drive to Oklahoma to stay a night for a doctor's appointment. My uncle lives in Oklahoma, so we stayed there instead of getting a hotel room. My uncle's house used to belong to my grandparents, his and my mother's parents. The house was built in 1951, with many occupants before my grandparents bought it. I don't know much on the history of the house. The house overall has an uneasy feeling to it. Most of the upstairs is blocked off due to the amount of stuff that my grandparents have kept up there. It's almost a hoarder's house with how many things they have. My grandmother actually passed away in the house. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal, but also extremely intrigued. I'm normally not one to think too much of it, but night eventually fell, and it was time to go to sleep. There's only one functional bedroom out of 5 in the house, and it belongs to my uncle, so my mother and I had to settle down in the living room. My mother got the inflatable mattress, and I took the couch. We were both exhausted, but I couldn't fall asleep. I just felt so uneasy. The air was heavy and cold. There were so many noises, like bumps and creaks, but I chalked it up to the house settling, or raccoons. My boyfriend had gone to a party that night and hadn't been answering for a while, so I just assumed that was what was making me nervous. I did my best to try to fall asleep, but I still couldn't, so I decided to get on Snapchat and talk to some of my friends. At about 5 a.m., I accidentally swiped up on my Snapchat and see my saved photos. I see one that I had saved from earlier, but I don't remember saving it at all. So, being curious, I go to look at it. I hold down on the photo so I can see what time it was taken, and it reads 11:38 p.m. I take a closer look at the photo to see a very white, grinning face in the background. I'm frozen in fear. The face showed so much maliciousness. You could see the eyes, which were white, and I was absolutely terrified. I couldn't stop looking. I laid there for a moment, whispering to my mom, trying to wake her up. After a bit, I hear her whisper, "What?" back to me. Still scared, I get up and walk over to her, saying that there's someone in this picture that I took. She's telling me that she doesn't want to see it because she doesn't like that kind of stuff. I'm still terrified, and I curl up into bed next to her. The sun begins to shine through the windows, and I felt a bit more safe with the sun rising. I got back on the couch after a bit, and I ended up falling asleep around 6 a.m. I spent the next day thinking about it and feeling so nervous and nauseous. My mom told me that it was just my imagination, but I was feeling uncomfortable the whole night, so I just brushed her off. After that, I've never had any more experiences at that house other than feeling uncomfortable. It may have just been a one-time thing, or just my imagination like my mother said. I'm not sure. But what do you think about it? I've attached the photo that I took that night. I hope it finds you well. And thank you once again for allowing us to share our stories. Blessed be, Kelly. As always, you can find Kelly's very interesting picture on our forum, and you can find a link to our forum in the show notes. Our next experience of the night comes to us from Hoss, and Hoss's story is called The Man in a Black Suit. Hoss says, "Hello. I'm not sure if you still do listener stories. I'm about a year behind on the podcast. My story is not directly mine, but I have felt it, or him. At my brother's shop there is an entity that stays in the shadows and in the dark. By all of the accounts of the people that work at the shop, this entity is in the form of a man with no face wearing a black suit. This being has a history at this shop, as well as unexplained injuries after sightings. We will start with last night when I was last there. It was about 9:50 at night in West Texas, and at this time of year it gets dark outside at 6:30. While me, my fiancé, my brother, and his wife were chatting and messing around, my fiancé and his wife went to go and find the man in the black suit, and reluctantly, me and my brother followed. As soon as we got to the room that he lived in, the moment I had the intention of looking into the dark, I felt pain, and something so evil that I couldn't take my eyes off of it. That feeling persisted until after I was home. The whole time I knew that I was being watched, but I didn't know by what. Everyone that works at that shop that has seen this man in a black suit has lost something to him. A finger, a toe, a foot, or an arm, and he has made a lathe chuck fly out of its machine with no prior incidents. There has been other incidents where machines will turn on randomly like lathes, bandsaws, and even shop cranes will move without warning. Other times the shop forklift will start by itself, even though it requires a tool to start. After the people at this shop had lost something to this man in a suit, the dread and evil they felt beforehand seemed to disappear. I'm not sure what this man is, but I know the feeling is always there, and he comes out night or day, and he is darker than the dark. Thank you for reading this. I hope it might end up on the podcast, and I love your show. From Hoss. Our next experience of the evening comes to us from Dustin. And Dustin says, "Hi there. I'm writing this in regards to the last podcast I heard, which was number 172, I believe. The guide describes everything to a T that has and is happening to me as we speak. Well, all except for the lady in the mirror being upside down. At my house there are mirages that run around throughout it all the time. I can see them more than my wife, but my son is only 3, and he can see them too. I believe that they mess with him more so than not, and I am scared for him because they are messing with me, and they hurt me. Right as I speak, you may not believe this, but these mirages wrapped around my body like a snake, constricting me and going into my ear like a worm. They leave scratch marks on me, and they break things in my house. They chase my son a lot of times, and he cries. I went to a witch woman to try to rid myself of them and the house, but to no avail. I don't know what to do or who to call for help, but I am totally afraid of what they will do next. They follow me everywhere I go, and are stronger within the house, but even outside the house they still hold power. Every time I sit down on a piece of furniture, you can feel them jump up on it like an animal would, and they start walking towards me every time. Last week they really have been active and doing things they haven't done before. They went deep within my ear, and it actually hurts. I can pull a mirage out of my ear like a piece of string. I know it sounds crazy, but you of all people must have heard something similar to mine. If you can please think of anything that I may be able to do to help in this matter, please contact me. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy person, but if you have any ideas to be rid of these things, please tell me as soon as possible, before anything else happens. Thank you again. Respectfully, Dustin. If anyone listening has advice for Dustin, please contact me directly, and I'll be sure to put you in contact with him. Our next experience of the night comes to us from DJ, and DJ's story is called A Haunting on Apache Street. DJ says, My husband at the time, he's now deceased, and I moved into a house on Apache Street in a small town in Oklahoma with our 4 children. Everything was going good the first few days. The house had a wall in the middle of the house that separated the living room and the kitchen. Walking around the right side of the wall, you would pass 2 bedrooms. First was our room, and the second was the girls' room. The boys' room was in the back of the house, behind the kitchen. Then you would walk around the kitchen and around the back of the living room to the left of the wall. Almost a week after moving in, I was sitting in the living room on the couch that was backed up to the wall. The front door had a small window at the top of it. The screen door was heavy and not easy to open, but all of a sudden the screen door opened slowly, like someone was opening it. I assumed that someone was at the door, and as I was waiting for a knock, the screen door then slammed hard. It made me jump. I jumped up and ran over to the door, but nobody was there. Then we started seeing this black cat hanging around. It would kill the squirrels and eat the head, and leave the body on the stoop. It was a very strange cat. It would hiss at anyone that was close to it, and several very strange things happened the next few weeks. The kids became so frightened that they no longer would sleep in their own rooms. They wanted to sleep on the floor in our room. One day I was in the kitchen, and the kids and I were eating crackers. We had eaten them all, and the kids went to go play. I started on the dishes that were left from lunch when something caught my eye. The cracker wrapper was still on the counter, and it started moving slowly and sliding down the counter to the edge. It then flew, stopped in the air, and then straight down onto the floor. I stood there in shock. Then I felt pressure around me from behind, and then a deep, scary growling. I screamed, "Jesus, help me!" and the pressure and growling then disappeared. I grabbed the kids and ran to a neighbor's house, and we never went back inside that house. Now the kids are grown, and they talk about that cat. They say that the cat would walk around our bedroom, and they say that it walked across the headboard of our bed, and that its eyes would glow. We never let that cat in the house, and we didn't have a headboard. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I appreciate all of you for being here, and a special thank you goes out to Joe, Peggy, Chrissy, Kelly, Haas, Dustin, and DJ for sharing their experiences. And of course, if you've had a paranormal experience and would like to share your story with me, you may contact us through email, voice message, or on our website via the links in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great weekend, and I'll see you back here on Monday with our next episode. From everyone at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there